pulling the slack in the deadlift. What this video is going to be about is we're going to go over the mechanics that you're using. We're going to kind of point out some of the good things, some of the things that need work, and then I'm going to give you some cues and ultimately a visual on how we want to pull the slack in the end, essentially where you're going to go from here. So what you do well is you generate a lot of tension dynamically, but the issue with that meaning, or rather, what I mean by dynamically is when you go down to the bar and you're kind of resting here, getting your hype, about to get your breath, and then you're about to get your tension and go, what you do really well is you load the hips pretty well, and dynamically you're really good at starting rounded and then pushing that chest through and lifting with a relatively flat back. But what you'll notice is as soon as you put tension to the bar, you start to round out. Your body does what we call the stripper pull, which is basically just this, except yours is very small. And then once everything gets tension, that's where the lift comes from, or the tension comes from. But the problem with that is, because what ends up happening is you do the little stripper pull and you lift, you end up getting stuck like this, and your whole body weight has to go forward. And then you're locking out here, where there's not a lot of tension and not a lot of balance. So, the two things we're going to work on is going to be setting your back first and then pulling the slack. So, setting your back first, what do I mean? Again, when you were going down, loosey-goosey, getting your hype, doing your thing, you go from here, and then you go to lift, and you're here. What I want you to focus on for the first part is, even before you do your hip shoot and your hip load, I want you to think extend or long spine. So you're going to go from here and you're going to pull from here. If you round, that's okay. We're just trying to get the cue down. So the second part, and arguably the more important part, because always remember, a rounded back deadlift is actually totally safe and totally okay within reason. So for the hip shoot, what you do really well is you extend your knees pretty well. You're right here, and then you go to town. But the problem is, you're not generating as much force as you could, or rather, you're not generating enough initial tension for your actual lift to then generate the force into the bar. So, we have two cues. You can use either one or both, it doesn't really matter. Essentially what I want you to get down ultimately is something more along the lines of this, and then we'll cue in a moment. So, you have your back active, you're ready to go. You can press into the floor using your legs, right? So you're actually gonna load that way, because if your knees fully extend this way, that means that there's no tension from the muscles being generated and placed into the bar. It's just muscular tension. So by pushing into the ground, transferring that hip load into the bar, you're essentially attempting to lift the bar off the ground with just the hip load. So one way you know that you're doing that right is when you do go to push into the ground, your hamstrings during the load will be so taut, so tensioned, that your knees can't physically extend all the way. You're gonna end up loading maybe at roughly this angle or somewhere between. When you do it right, you'll know, because your hamstring will be so taut and so tensioned that they'll feel like they're ripping off of the ischial tubes. So that's one cue, is just pushing into the ground. And then the other cue is, how do you say, we could kind of go the opposite direction, right? We can essentially squat down to the bar, which you'll see with my conventional deadlift, where just kind of squat, 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 and you'll actually notice that your hamstrings don't have a lot of tension, but your glutes and your quads have all the tension in the world. You're gonna set your back, and then that's when you use the knees back just a little bit to generate that tension, and then bam, hip shoot, and you go to town. Ideally, the tension alone will rectify the stripper pull dumping part, but that'll also come with time, with more hinging stuff that we're gonna do, because we're only on week 2, not a big deal. I guess if you wanted to add one third cue, totally optional, just more of a cognitive thing, is when you're lifting for the conventional deadlift, you can think knees back and hips forward at the same time. So it's kind of like a this motion, Yeah, that. Bam, there it is. And so what ends up manifesting when you do that isn't actually, it's not gonna look how it feels, right? You're not actually squatting the bar up. It's just gonna eliminate the stripper pull because it's a true hip hinge. So if you think knees back with the hips forward, bam, all happens at the same time, you don't end up here and you're good to go. But for the moment, just ignore that cue. I thought it was just something for you to think about. Let's do a quick review of the two things that we're focusing on for this week in this cycle. Number one is going to be setting your back before you actually hip load. So instead of starting here, you're going to tension and then do your deadlifts and everything. The second part is pulling the slack. To make it real short, you have one or two cues or a mix of the two. First cue being pressing your feet into the ground to load the hips, and then you do your hip shoot and deadlift. And then the other way you can think about it is squatting down to the bar, down to the bar, down the bar, and then using your knees back and hips forward, bam, to generate that tension. Pull the slack, and then do your hip shoot. Let me know if you got any questions.